Ladies and gentlemen, I should begin by thanking Jan Driessen for inviting me to speak to you and apologising that this may not be quite the topic that you were expecting. Originally, I was asked to cover the mainland only in later LH IIIB. But although the mainland was the heartland of Mycenaean civilization, by LH IIIB, roughly equivalent to the 13th century BC, most of the Aegean had become part of the Mycenaean world, and only Crete retained many distinctive features of its Minoan past. Also, surprisingly little can be dated specifically to the later part of LH IIIB, as is evident from a look through what is attributed specifically to the LH IIIB2 phase, pottery phase, in Penelope Mountjoy's book, Regional Mycenaean Decorated Pottery. There is a simple reason for this. The phase LH IIIB2 is most easily identified through open shapes, particularly varieties of deep bowl, particularly it's identified through varieties of deep bowl, a shape absolutely typical of the period. The deep bowl is very common in settlement deposits, but was rarely deposited in tombs, which are major sources of our information. Sue Sherratt demonstrated long ago how variable the appearance of specifically LH IIIB2 features outside the argolid are. And you see that from the picture. For whatever reason, the innovations introduced by the argolid potters, who evidently led the development of the Mycenaean pottery style for most of its history, were not followed throughout the Mycenaean world. This has encouraged me to assess the developed Mycenaean civilization as a whole, because the later 13th century BC represents the final phase of the palace societies that had dominated Mycenaean civilization for much of 2 centuries. Although many of the major settlements survived the civilization's collapse around 1200 BC, and the material culture of the succeeding post-palatial period continued to be essentially Mycenaean, a whole way of life that could reasonably be termed civilized was gone forever. So, what was Mycenaean civilization like in its full form? A lot of people think they know, and have been telling us so in books and articles from the beginnings of Aegean archaeology. Even today, it's possible to find quotations not merely in popularizing works, but in thoroughly academic books, which show that it seems impossible to kill off the idea that the Mycenaeans, or rather their elite, their ruling class, which is what almost all generalizations about the Mycenaeans are actually referring to, were warlike. In the Oxford Handbook of the Aegean Bronze Age Aegean, Ioannis Georganas says, in accepting the idea that the dendra cuirass was parade armour, this seems to fit well with the aristocratic nature of the Mycenaean society, where rulers and other members of the elite measured their status and prestige by personal skill at arms. How can he possibly know this? There is no contemporary account of these people. He can only state this if he believes, in the face of all the arguments for thinking differently, that the Iliad depicts the typical behaviour of Mycenaean kings and princes. If Homeric evidence is discounted, as I think it should be, what is the basis for this picture of a society dominated by a warlike aristocracy? I have argued elsewhere in the publication Authormeter, the Festschrift for Sue Sherratt, in a paper called How Warlike Were the Mycenaeans in Reality, that its basis is essentially a series of striking images. You start with the most memorable stele from the shaft graves. Perhaps you show some early weapons and the dendrocuirass, or a helmeted head inlay. Then you use a reconstructed Pylos fresco. This is the new reconstruction, not the one by Piet de Jong, which you will notice doesn't show the heads of the sheepskin wearers as shaggy as his version did, but it's closer to what they now have been able to put together. Also, you will show a view of a Cyclopean fortification. Mycenaean itself is the best. And you cite the records of weapons, armour and chariots in the Linear B texts to represent palatial times. Finally, you show the warrior vase, perhaps the Tyrrhen's chariot scene, maybe even the Kinos ship battle, and some impressive weapons and armour. This is from the chamber tomb at Portes in Ahhiyawa, to cover post-palatial times. This totally impressionistic picture, lacking any analysis of context or statistics, is supposed to represent the Mycenaeans, whose basic nature apparently remained unchanged over half a millennium. The classes of evidence that these examples represent are in fact rare to very rare, except for weapons. And one, the Linear B records of war-related equipment, is quite unsurprising. The Mycenaean palace states had to be prepared for the possibility of war, like their Near Eastern counterparts, which are not usually defined as warlike, though they fought wars enough. Weapon burials and representations of warriors and warfare are mostly found in the earliest and latest Mycenaean phases on either side of the palace period, while examples of weapon burial in the palace period are most often found in what might be called frontier areas, such as Thessaly and the islands of Rhodes and Kos. These last are particularly unsurprising, since to judge from Hittite and Egyptian sources, the East Aegean and East Mediterranean were areas in which piratical raiding was not uncommon. On the mainland too, outside the territories controlled by the palaces, the warrior behaviour of earlier times might survive, just as Thucydides comments that in his own day, characteristic features of the heroic past, like carrying weapons and piracy, were still prevalent in less developed areas of mainland Greece, like Aetolia. A better pointer to how we should envisage Mycenaean civilization at its height can be found in the famous Tawargalawa letter, written by a king of the Hittites to the king of a territory called Ahhiyawa, which there is strong reason to believe was a Mycenaean state. The name may be an Anatolianization of Ahhiyawa, land of the Achaeans, the name most commonly given to the Greeks in the Homeric poems. But it can hardly have referred to the whole Mycenaean world, rather to a single state, though one which might well have been dominant in that world. The Tawargalawa letter is now generally assigned to, where's he gone? To Hattusili III, who had overthrown his nephew. I shall assume this for ease of reference. As you see from the chart, that would date it to the middle third of the 13th century. Because we have only the third tablet of the letter, we do not have the formal greeting to the king that it was addressed to, but Hattusili treats him with considerable respect, constantly addressing or referring to him as my brother, sometimes adding, the great king, my peer. Thus, in the terminology of international diplomacy of the time, he recognizes him as an equal. The main purpose of the letter is to get the king of Ahhiyawa to deal with the problem caused by Piyama Radu, a notable enemy of the Hittites, who was giving them serious trouble in western Anatolia and was taking refuge in Ahhiyawan territory. The main purpose, yes, sorry, I've said that. This is clearly not the first letter in the correspondence. The king of Ahhiyawa is not being very cooperative, evidently because he has grievances. Hence, a messenger whom he had sent previously to Hattusili brought neither greetings nor gift, as would be expected in international diplomacy. Simply a curt message that the local ruler of Milawanda, that is Miletus, almost certainly, an Ahhiyawan dependency, had been ordered to hand Piyama Radu over. Other passages in the letter give indications of the king of Ahhiyawa's grievances. There had recently been hostility between the Hittites and Ahhiyawa. That's where I'm going to go. Over Wilusa, which you'll see next to Troy. Very likely, this is the territory, it is now generally assumed, in fact, I think, of which Troy, which is called Wilios in the Iliad as well, was the capital. The matter was settled diplomatically, and significantly, Hattusili admits that he was in the wrong. So, no sign of any Mycenaean eagerness for war here. And nothing, of course, to link up with the story of the Iliad, so often interpreted as a mythicization of Mycenaean activity in Anatolia and eagerness for territory, etc. There was also an unresolved matter, of which we know only that the king of Ahhiyawa complained, "You used force against me." Again, hardly the complaint of someone warlike. This seems to have been some time ago, because Hattusili apparently excuses it on the grounds that he was young then. Now he's keen to resolve the problem, and he offers a trustworthy envoy, Tapala Tahunda, who has been his charioteer and is a relative of his wife, a man who is also well known to Tawagalawa, who is the king of Ahhiyawa's brother. And he had often acted as Tawagalawa's charioteer as well, presumably in Anatolia, where Tawagalawa was apparently based to oversee Ahhiyawan interests. There are other reasons why Hattusili should want good relations with Ahhiyawa. It was one of the states to which his nephew had appealed, though in vain, for help in regaining his throne. But suppose the king of Ahhiyawa changed his mind. At this time, Egypt and Assyria were basically hostile to the Hittites, threatening then from the east and the south. If there was serious trouble in the west as well, the Hittites might have a very hard time keeping control of it all. What remains striking is how Hattusili is so ready to treat the king of Ahhiyawa as an equal, and that Hittites and Ahhiyawans of high rank might know each other and meet personally. A fragment of another letter could suggest that Ahhiyawa was thought an appropriate place of exile for a Hittite queen in the late 14th or early 13th century. Yet another letter, now agreed to be from a king of Ahhiyawa to a predecessor of Hattusili, perhaps his elder brother, shows that Ahhiyawa was in diplomatic contact with the kingdoms of Western Anatolia that were now in the 13th century subject to the Hittites, that this contact had been going on for a century or more earlier. This letter refers to a gift of islands, perhaps a dowry, made to his ancestor from the king of Ahhiyawa, which was a territory apparently taking in much of the northwest of Anatolia and seems to be in kind of confederacy, but nevertheless there was a single king. These islands were conquered around 1400 BC by this earlier king. Go back. Yes, Tudhaliya the First stroke second. I have to say him like that because there is a disagreement among Hittitologists about whether there were two Tudhaliyas at that time or only one. The islands, as I say, were conquered by the Hittites, and the king of Ahhiyawa in the earlier 13th century wants them back. He addresses the king of the Hittites, to whom he writes, as my brother. So already there are these diplomatic relations between the Hittites and Ahhiyawa on grounds of equality. Hattusili was not innovating in this respect. Ahhiyawa has been something of an elephant in the room, where the nature of Mycenaean civilization is under discussion. I think specialists have not quite adapted to the idea that a Mycenaean ruler could be so powerful that a Hittite king could treat him as an equal. But by the mid-13th century, Ahhiyawa evidently controlled not only territory around Miletus, but at least some of the Greek islands as well as its home territory, and had interests in Anatolia from Wilusa in the northwest to the Laka territories, which seem to have been the prehistoric equivalent of Lycia in classical times, in the southwest. The center of Ahhiyawa was evidently too far from Anatolia for the Hittites to contemplate attacking it, which was their normal practice when powers that might rival them developed. And I think this rules out the island of Rhodes, which has been suggested more than once to be its centre, but where no sign of an appropriately wealthy and powerful state has been identified in any case. I believe that its most likely centre was Mycenae itself, although a case has been made for Thebes. It has been objected that no trace of documents written in Hittite or Akkadian, the language of international diplomacy at the time, has been found at Mycenae or indeed anywhere else in the Mycenaean world. But the same is true of Cyprus. If, as is generally believed, Cyprus was or included the Al-Ashir, whose kings corresponded, as we have the letters, with Egyptian pharaohs and the kings of Ugarit in Syria. We need to remember that only a small fraction of the diplomatic correspondence between the late Bronze Age powers has survived. The failure to find anything at Mycenae is therefore hardly surprising. I will pause here to remark that, of course, Greek tradition contains no hint of such a great state, except possibly one reference in the Iliad, to Agamemnon as king of many islands and all Argos, Book 2, line 108. Thucydides interpreted this to mean simply that he possessed a fleet. This silence, though, simply reinforces my belief in the uselessness of Greek tradition as a historical source for the late Bronze Age, which is underlined by its failure to preserve any memory of the Hittites at all. How should we imagine the Mycenaean world in which Ahhiyawa bulked so large. I do not believe that this state controlled the whole of Mycenaean Greece. It was surely foremost, but it must have had rivals. Pylos in the southwest. It doesn't want to move. Thebes and Orchomenos in Boeotia are the most obvious. But I believe that, oh, no, that's right. Yes. Maps like this, neatly subdividing the Mycenaean heartland between a few centres, are extremely misleading. Rather, I suspect that Palace period Mycenaean Greece resembled the Near East of the same period. Bordering on the most developed states would be less organised political units, ranging from principalities with an established ruler to loose tribal groupings, like the Lucca and the Casca in Anatolia. These might be dependents, allies, or potential enemies of the greater powers. While local rivalries and individual ambitions might lead to wars, as in historical Greece, and the tribal groups might launch raids against their richer neighbours, as the Casca constantly did against the Hittites, overall, I would suggest that conditions were fairly peaceful. The extreme rarity of fortifications for much of the period and the scattering of the population among a multitude of mostly small and apparently undefended settlements in many regions suggests a basic feeling of security. This serves as a reminder that the economic basis of Mycenaean civilization was essentially agricultural. Despite all the evidence for fine craftwork in many different materials, typically Mycenaean manufactured items, apart from pottery, are rarely found outside the Aegean, and never in bulk, except, again, for pottery. What the Aegeans sent out in trade, now as in historical times, could have included raw materials like timber and silver, but must largely have consisted of perishable goods like textiles and natural products. We have written evidence that Sinoranu, a rich merchant from Ugarit who traded with Kaptara, generally accepted to be Crete, brought back grain, beer, and oil. And one can imagine that other products like this, such as wine, honey, cheese, herbs, could be carried in the variety of attractively decorated container shapes that make up a large proportion of the Mycenaean pottery found in the Near East. I draw your attention to the stirrup jar shape, which most of them belong to, and particularly the large ones, number 6, the storage stirrup jar shape, which is particularly a product of Crete, and where they're found anywhere in the Mediterranean, they've got a good chance of being Cretan, but there are also mainland examples. Also, I draw your attention to number 4, the flask shape, which is originally a Near Eastern Levantine shape, but which has been adopted into Mycenaean pottery for the same purpose as the little stirrup jars. It has a very narrow neck. You can shake out a few drops at a time. The contents would have been scented oil, the ancient equivalent of perfume. And therefore, you don't want to use it all up fast. The leading centres of the Mycenaean world could also have benefited from their proximity to remoter regions like the central Mediterranean, North Aegean, and Balkans, by passing on useful commodities that these produced, raw materials like metals and timber, exotica like animal furs and amber, basic foodstuffs like grain, which would always be in demand, possibly even slaves. I lay emphasis on this because I am convinced that the wealth of the Mycenaean ruling class and the general prosperity of the Aegean derived very largely from trade, which was extremely lively in this period. Now that plain and coarse wares are being analysed, as well as decorated pottery, there is much evidence for a considerable traffic in containers and specialised domestic vessels within the Aegean from a variety of sources. Whereas the decorated pottery found in large quantities in the East Aegean and Near East came very largely from the Argolid. Perhaps another argument for centering Ahhiyawa there. From an early stage, also, Cypriot and Levantine containers were also entering the Aegean and going up the Anatolian coast to Miletus and Troy. Some even reached the central Mediterranean, though they may have travelled so far in ships whose home bases were Mycenaean. This is a sign, though, of how intermeshed the trading networks of the eastern and central Mediterranean were from the 15th century onwards, as demonstrated by the very mixed cargo, including 24 decorated Mycenaean pots and some probably Cretan storage stirrup jars from the famous Uluburun shipwreck off the south coast of Turkey, which dates a little before 1300 BC. Attempts are sometimes made to downplay the idea that Mycenaean traders played an active role in all this activity, especially in the Near East. It has been commented that not a single merchant of Aegean origin seems to be mentioned in the plentiful documentary material from Ugarit. However, as I have noted, a Levantine flask shape was adopted into the Mycenaean potter's repertoire. Not the only example of production to meet regional preferences, of which knowledge would have to come from personal experience. Penelope Mountjoy has drawn attention to late Helladic IIIB shapes that were apparently produced specifically for the Cypriot market. In this case, vessels for food and drink, likely to be used in feasting. Late Helladic IIIB was also the phase in which Mycenaean interest in the central Mediterranean, stretching as far as Sardinia, became strong. The circles marked suggest areas that were particularly focused on for trade. The reference to analysed is the analysis of material with an attempt to prove its origin. There's been a long programme has been carried out on this work, which has now been published. This trade was often on a remarkable scale. At Roccavecchia on the Apulian coast, where the Mycenaean connection began in the 15th century, at least 5,000 imported and imitation Mycenaean pottery fragments have been found. And there are exotic imports, including hippopotamus ivory, ultimately from the Near East, which was clearly being worked at Roccavecchia. Other skills, such as potting with the potter's wheel and manufacturing glass, possibly even the cultivation of the olive, began to be taken up in Italy at this time, clearly, again, through contact with the East Mediterranean. The strength of the Mycenaean connection in this region is underlined by the fact that Mycenaean decorated pottery, especially open shapes that could be used for food and drink, began to be widely imitated in the central Mediterranean, as it also was in central parts of Macedonia and at Troy, where it actually seems as if a Mycenaean potting family settled, because the pottery, apart from its fabric, is indistinguishable from Mycenaean homeland material. So Mycenaean civilization was making a vigorous impression abroad. What was it like at home? A whole series of monumental public works that must have required considerable resources can be identified in the most advanced regions. Not merely the well-known palatial buildings and cyclopean fortifications, but traces of aqueduct systems at Thebes, an artificial harbour at Pylos, dams to prevent rivers overflowing at Mycenaean Tiryns, road systems with bridges and culverts, and the elaborate system of dams, dikes and levees used to drain much of Lake Copaeus in Boeotia, work that was surely undertaken by Orchomenos, the nearest palatial site, but which the great fortified site of Glar, the biggest Mycenaean fortification on a kind of what was originally an islet in the north side of the lake, this may have been built to control the whole system. And so the produce of the land that was, and it's a very fertile land, that was produced. Recent survey work at Glar, led by Professor Christophilis Mangidis, to whom I am indebted for information and permission to show this illustration, suggests it may even have been a city. For a long time, people have imagined that it was empty apart from the area surrounded sectors 1, 2 and 3. Now, there's definite evidence of structures outside that, and it may have been a complete city. But this tempting hypothesis needs to be verified by excavation. These great works demonstrate much practical skill in engineering. No doubt this was originally developed in the construction of Tholos tombs. I think it no accident that they were undertaken at a time when close contacts with the Near Eastern civilizations could have inspired rivalry. Some of the techniques used, like the half-timbering system used in major buildings, may reflect specific influence from Anatolia. But as far as I know, the reinvention of the terracotta roof tile, which briefly appeared on the mainland in early Helladic II in the early Bronze Age, was a purely Mycenaean development. These have now been found at many major sites, both the flat pan tiles and the curved cover tiles, associated with special buildings, so it seems, but not the palaces themselves, which continued to be roofed in the traditional flat roof style. Now, if a Hittite queen was exiled to Ahhiyawa in the late 14th or early 13th century and came to Mycenae, she might well have found it small and rather rustic by Hittite standards. With the great Tholos tombs and the earliest stage of the fortification, the most conspicuous monuments to admire. But over the 13th century, there was a prolonged building boom at Mycenae, produced most of what we are familiar with, including the surviving remains of the palace, the walls surrounding the southwest slope, with the Lion Gate, as you see, the entrance that survives to this day, and a whole series of structures constructed on that southwest slope, both the cult centre south of the grave circle and the elaborate groups of buildings in the north, in the southwest, north of the grave circle, and in the northwest corner. There's now more. This is quite an old slide. There's now more buildings there as well. All these seem to date in late Helladic IIIB. And here's a nice close-up view of the Lion Gate for you. And in the lower town also, many groups of buildings were built. What is marked on the map as the oil merchant group, now known as the Ivory Houses, is one of the most significant. Further down on the ridge, the Panayia houses. To the north of Mycenae, the Plaques house, all seem to belong to this period. And there is evidence of an outer fortification wall with 3 gates, one of which has been found in what is marked as survey area. And the alignment is the same as the road which ran past the oil merchant house group. And then the North Peloponnesian road system that radiates from Mycenae, again, this is quite an old slide from Lord William Taylor's The Mycenaeans, is also dated to this period. But although we have an idea of the total extent now of Mycenae's settled area at its largest, some 30 to 32 hectares, bigger than some Cypriot and Syrian cities, I would point out, we remain largely ignorant of the town's layout. And this is the case with all the major centres, because simply of really the preoccupations of excavators. We do have evidence of a less impressive city wall and many substantial structures, some frescoed, at Thebes. And there may have been a city wall in the lower town at Pylos. Apart from Glar, we know of other new foundations, but the most town-like found so far, started in the 14th century, is Vimini, near Volos. This, at the time, was a coastal site, built on level ground by the old Neolithic mound, whose name might be familiar to many of you, ultimately some 10 hectares in size. The excavator would like to identify it with the prehistoric version of Iolkos, which was later situated at modern Volos. You can walk between them in less than half a morning. I've done it once. But it does now seem as if an actual fragment of a Linear B tablet has been found at Volos, which is more than has shown up at Vimini. So what it is, it's a very good example, though, of what a town could possibly have been like. It has a very wide street, which is flanked by structures much more substantial than the average Mycenaean house. But it did not have drainage along the streets, as found in earlier Aegean towns in Crete and on Thera. Megaron A, can I get there? No, I can't get there. Megaron A, you see the buildings north of the street, very elaborate ones. This had its own drainage system, and like the great majority of Mycenaean settlements, although it was big, this site seems to have been unfortified. We know so little that we cannot be certain how common such towns were. My impression is not very, but I may be biased by familiarity with Nichoria in Messenia, where I was involved in excavations in the 70s. Although this is widely thought to be the capital of one of the subdivisions of the Pylos state, the one written in Linear B as Timito Akee, and has its own Tholos tomb, in use throughout the palace period, it looks like little more than a large village, with typical houses of 2 to 4 rooms scattered haphazardly over a wide terrain. And you see much of area 4 where we excavated a series of houses. There is no town-like appearance to it at all. And yet these buildings date from the later 14th to the 13th centuries. And the estimated population of this site is no more than about 800. So a large village in ancient terms is all that it would be population-wise. It could be argued from the marked contrast between the great buildings and the unimpressive housing and settlements of the majority that Mycenaean society was not only strongly hierarchical, but that the mass of population was poor and potentially oppressed. But there are counter-arguments. That the finely made Mycenaean pottery can be found at the smallest sites recognized. That the ordinary houses that have been excavated are certainly more than hovels. That the Pylos texts do not suggest very demanding taxation regimes. And that the most characteristic Mycenaean form of grave, the chamber tomb, is found in such numbers that the users of such tombs, which must have been constructed by professionals, cannot all have formed an elite, as we usually understand the term. Chamber tombs range in size, quality, and offerings to the dead, from what might be considered princely, one at Thebes even contained frescoes, to small and poorly provided. Yet the same rites for the dead seem to have been practiced in them, as also in types of stone-built tomb, favoured in some regions. There was clearly a substantial middle class of the population that shared important belief systems with the ruling class, although they may still have added up to a minority. For example, relatively few names are cited in the landholding texts of Pylos. There was surely a large underclass who could not aspire to chamber tombs or similar tombs. Did they feel oppressed, maybe? We know far too little still about ordinary Mycenaeans. The widespread of very similar burial customs is one facet of the frequently mentioned homogeneity of Mycenaean material culture, which is evident in the use of the same types of pottery and artifact throughout the cultural region. Sometimes it has been cited as an argument for political unity, although there is actually quite a lot of evidence for local preferences in tomb type and pottery. And although the typical Mycenaean clay figurines are universally found, they are much less common outside the argolid than in it. Lisa French has famously said that any basket of earth from Mycenae would have at least 6 fragments. Well, at Nicoria we found something, a couple of hundred, and goodness knows how many baskets we excavated. This is surprising, as it's now beginning to be thought that these figurines represent something like a palatial ideology. But overall, the material evidence suggests a closely knit and prospering culture, which maintained high standards of craftsmanship, even if it shows few signs of innovation. A different viewpoint would detect seeds of the coming collapse in the palace society framework. But I would challenge the interpretations, often presented as facts, on which it is based. I'm referring here particularly to Sigrid Dega-Jalkotzi's account in the Cambridge Companion to the Aegean Bronze Age. Was it over-specialised and over-centralised? Paul Halstead has demonstrated that there were 2 economies in a palace society. That of the palace estates, which was indeed specialised and closely overseen, and that of the ordinary communities, which practiced mixed agriculture and stock rearing, much like their predecessors, and interacted with the palace economy only in specific ways and certain areas. Did the palace society prevalence involve a massive increase in the population? But the estimated populations do not exceed later historical estimates. And This is again an old map, and there should be a lot more dots on it in some places. But many of these dots are actually cemeteries anyway, not settlements, but quite a lot of them are settlements. The thing is that we don't know the history of these dots. Were they all occupied at the same time? Did they continue in occupation to the end of the period? Or could one imagine a smaller population that moved around from one small village site to another in the course of the period? Was there general over-exploitation of the land and decline in the quality of the crops? Only evidence from the Argolid is cited, but there were many other palatial areas. As I've said, Pylos, Boeotia, both of which are good producers of agricultural crops. So I remain unconvinced by this, again, rather impressionistic picture. Is it possible to detect signs of trouble within Mycenaean Greece? Evidence for the apparent destruction by fire or decline of local power centres can be traced back into the 15th century. Notable in the 14th are the burning of the palatial complex recently identified at Ios Vasilios, south of Sparta, south, in fact, of what is marked on the map as Menelaion, and of the palatial remains called the House of Cadmos at Thebes, in the latter case dated around the time of the late Hellenic 3A to B transition, so around 1300 BC. If either of these was the result of hostile action, one could imagine warfare between Mycenaean states. Was Mycenae trying to subdue rivals? Certainly it's not clear that there was such a major 13th century centre in Laconia, but Thebes did recover, and its fortification at this time may be designed to defend against another attack. Yet, as is often pointed out in debate about the possibility of a historical Trojan War, it's hard to be sure that a fire destruction was caused by a hostile attack rather than accident or earthquake, and it's harder still to assign blame for it. Several other destructions affect important buildings at Thebes during late Hellenic 3B. Are these all to be attributed to human enemies? The problem is raised again at the end of LH IIIB1 in the second half of the 13th century, when the ivory houses at Mycenae were destroyed by fire, and there is evidence for significant destruction elsewhere in the Argolid. This evidence has been woven into a scenario that suggests that the final extension of fortifications at Mycenae and Tiryns in LH IIIB2, their construction for the first time at Medea, at Athens, perhaps also Crisa, Crisa in Phocis, and Techos Dimaion in Achaia, the northwest tip of the Peloponnese, where they're not closely datable, in fact, within LH IIIB, but these are signs of an emergency, for which evidence has also been found in the new arrangement at Mycenae, with movement of administration and craft establishments inside the citadel, and also in the content of various Pylos texts. On the international scene, it has been argued that Ahhiyawa declined in the later 13th century. Certainly the son of Hattusili, Tudhaliya IV, did not consider the king of Ahhiyawa an equal. Notoriously, this title was struck on the tablet from, which is only a draft of the treaty with the king of Amurru, in which King Tudhaliya lists the kings whom he did consider equals. The king of Ahhiyawa was written, and it was struck out. It has even been suggested that Mycenaean trading activity overseas was in decline, which might cause tensions between the ruling classes of the leading states as they tried to maintain their position. All this could contribute to a picture of an age of anxiety. But for each argument, there is a counter-argument. The supposed signs of an emergency deduced from Pylos' text have been rejected by Cynthia Shelmerdine and others. The construction of walls in the Cyclopean style requires a lot of time, though not, in fact, much human labour. Such walls could hardly be thrown up hurriedly in response to an immediate threat. Since at least parts of the Mycenaean lower town continued in use, and we now have this evidence for an outer wall, it seems rash to draw large conclusions from what happened in particular areas. The ivory houses, it is true, were not rebuilt, but there may be particular reasons for this that have nothing to do with withdrawing into the citadel. The idea that there was a downturn in overseas trade has been questioned by Penelope Mountjoy with regard to the evidence from Cyprus. And Tutelia's treaty draft does at least show that Ahhiyawan ships could still be expected at Amuru ports, that is in the modern Lebanon, in the late 13th century. It is also quite unclear whether there was any slackening of trading activity in the central Mediterranean, where Mycenaeans were so prominent. There are nevertheless features which could suggest an increase in tension between major Mycenaean states. Thus, the arrangement of the fortified sites in the central Argolid, Mycenae, Tiryns and Medea, almost seem placed to watch approaches from different directions. Medea looking over the pass from the east, Tiryns from the coast, and Mycenae from the north. While Argos, which Lisa French has said to me is the only place from which you can see all the others and which is visible, could have been, as it were, a signal station. There is some evidence for a fortification there on the Larissa, the higher of the two acropolises, but Argos was not the important place in Mycenaean times that it was to be later in the early Iron Age. The fact that steps were taken to secure access to a water supply for the citadels at Mycenae, Tiryns and Athens. Lisa French has said in one of those unexplained statements that this might simply have been due to fashion. And it's worth commenting that Glar apparently had such an access to water supply, so as it were, you might have the idea that if you had a fortification that was worth anything at all, you had to have access to a water supply in it. But if so, it took the people at Mycenae and Tiryns a long time to decide this. Most telling of all, perhaps, is the destruction and abandonment of the site of Glar in late Helladic 3b2, but not apparently at the end of it. So is this a precursor of the trouble that was to take place at the end? But there are still problems which show we just don't know enough about the background. For instance, what do the new fortifications in Cyclopean style outside the Argolid represent? Athens is the only one that was quite a substantial settlement before, though not really prominent in the earlier palace period. Does its fortification represent a local state's wish to defend itself against its greater neighbours? Or is it an extension of the power of Mycenae, as has been argued by Jorit Kelder? And could the same be true of Crisa and Techos Dimaion? We have no real basis for choosing one explanation over another. Ultimately, I find the swathe of destructions at the end of late Helladic 3b as unexpected as the equally devastating destructions that brought pure Minoan civilization to an end in the 15th century. There is nothing to link the Mycenaean destructions very closely together in chronology. they could have spread over 10 or 20 years. So the course of events was probably extremely complex. They are certainly too widespread for all to be attributable to earthquake, which is the suggested cause at all three of the major argillid sites, Mycenaean, Tiryns and Medea. And even if that was true of the argillid sites, this does not mean that these destructions were without wider consequences. Earthquakes can destroy a lot of stored commodities, which are the capital of a Bronze Age state. They can also offer an opportunity to those who feel themselves downtrodden, as the Spartans found in 465 BC, when following a major earthquake centered on Sparta, the Mycenaeans went into revolt. Earthquakes can also be interpreted as signs of divine anger. Did subjects lose faith in their rulers? I could envisage a situation that developed quite suddenly in one region, set off reactions in others, and snowballed out of control. All sorts of factors could have been involved apart from earthquakes. Local droughts or outbreaks of disease, rivalries within the ruling class leading to civil wars, attacks by opportunistic neighbours. Parallels for a lot of this can be found in the collapse of the Hittite Empire. What we see in the post-palatial period suggests a fundamental shake-up of society had taken place. But unfortunately, the changes in attitude that might lie behind this are not something that can be readily identifiable by archaeological means. But certainly when order was restored, the new societies seem markedly less hierarchical than the old. But they were also less stable, and for a long time Greece, most of Greece, reverted to a poor and disorganized state. But that's another story. Thank you.